Hey everyone, today I'm covering obstacle departures in Flight Sim 2020. Obstacle departures are a way to depart an airport under instrument conditions, which are usually only published for airports that have some kind of obstruction, such as mountains or really big buildings around, that need to be avoided when you're flying with low visibility. Typically, if an ODP is published, you're not going to have a standard instrument departure. Sometimes you will have both, but from what I've noticed, you'll mainly find the ODPs in airports where there aren't any SIDs available. With that in mind, you might have no choice but to fly the obstacle departure if you want to fly under IFR conditions. They can also be useful for VFR flying when you're in a constrained space as well. I like doing them in the game because they're a lot of fun to interpret and then plot out and execute. It makes for a little bit of a challenge, which is why I decided to make a video out of it. A few concepts you'll want to be familiar with before watching this video are the basics of GPS navigation, how to intercept a VOR radial, as well as how to make a standard rate or rate 1 turn. You can find all the info on how to do that and more in the previous IFR videos that I made. I'll put links to them in the description below. Each ODP is different, but they all tend to follow a similar pattern. That usually means taking off and flying towards a fix and then either climbing in a hold or some other pattern, but which procedure you use is going to depend on the runway you're using and your direction of flight. I'm going to demonstrate one of the more complex ones, which is going to involve climbing in a holding pattern to a given altitude before continuing on to my destination. The first thing I had to do was find an ODP that was going to be interesting to fly, and I chose Erie Municipal just to the north of Denver, Colorado. The Rockies are just off to the left, so there's plenty of obstacles to avoid. All I did to find the obstacle departure procedure for the airport was to look it up on airnav.com, and then in the links near the bottom there was an option listed for takeoff minimums and departure procedures. Depending on where you're flying, you might have to do a little bit more research to find your ODP because they may not all be listed on AirNav. Usually just a little bit of Googling with the airport's name and ODP in the subject should do it. From there, all I did was look up Erie Muni within the document, and I found the description that I'm showing you on screen now. There are two sections, the takeoff minimums followed by the departure procedure based on the runway you're flying out of. To make things interesting, I'm going to fly out of runway 33. I'll walk you through all the text that's there, but first let's set up the flight. The first thing I did was choose my departure airport and departure runway, and then I toggled it to IFR low altitude airways. The reason for that is because I'm going to be flying under IFR. You should also be aware that there is a bug. If you choose VFR, the flight plan isn't going to be working properly at the moment. There are extra waypoints that get added, so one easy way to get around that is to just choose IFR. That's as of September 10th. Things may have changed since the last update. Next, I chose my destination airport, which is going to be Aspen-Pitkin County. We're not really going to talk about arrivals in this video, but in the departures procedure, as you can see, my only option was direct. The obstacle departure procedure is different based on which direction you're going to be flying, and doing a departure to the west is going to take me to that slightly more complicated and more interesting route. Alright, now it's time to add the first part of the ODP to my flight plan. The first part of the procedure says turn left, climb direct to the BJC VOR. To be able to see the BJC VOR, I had to go into open filters and I had to enable nav aids right here. Now if I zoom in, I should be able to see the BJC VOR, which is at Jeffco right here. I'm going to add it to my flight plan since the first thing I'm going to be doing is flying direct to this VOR. So I just click on it and I click add. The next part of the ODP says that if your departure is between radials 340 clockwise to 150, then you can just climb on course. That means that once you get to the BJC VOR, if you're going to be flying on a heading anywhere between 340 clockwise around the compass to 150 degrees when you're departing the VOR, you can just continue your flight as normally. I've put up a little graphic to make it a little bit clearer. You can see that green section means we can just depart BJC directly, but anything that isn't in that green section is going to require a few more steps. In those cases, I have to follow the other part of the procedure. The procedure says that I need to climb in a holding pattern at BJC. Now, I won't be able to add the hold in the flight planning screen right here, so I'm just going to leave that as is. What I will do though, and what I generally do for all of my flights, is that I'm going to print out a map of the area and I'm going to actually map out what my hold is going to look like. I'll go over all of the details to fly the hold once we're in the air because it'll just be a lot easier to see it rather than explain it. Alright, with all that said, I think we are pretty much ready to fly. Alright, so before I get going, I just want to remind you, if you did get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. If you have any comments, put them below. The departure procedure can be split up into 3 separate parts. The first part of the procedure reads something like this. Runway 33, turn left, climb direct to the BJC VOR DME. The flight path that got loaded into the GPS is already set to take me directly to the VOR, since that's what I set up in the flight planning screen. So from that perspective, I'm already all set up once I'm in the air to move to intercept the VOR as quickly as possible. Once I've got a little bit of air under me, I'm going to turn to intercept the flight path to get to the VOR. To do that, all I have to do is look at which way the purple needle is relative to the airplane and turn towards it to intercept. I've covered how to intercept GPS courses in previous videos, and I'll add a link to that one as well. But really, it's the simplest possible type of interception. You really just turn towards the arrow that's being pointed at on the compass. You adjust a little bit depending on how far off the middle needle is relative to where the airplane is, and then you just wait for the needle to recenter itself, and once it does, you just turn back on course to match the exact same heading that's being indicated in the course. As you can see, I'm only a few degrees off, so I need to keep an eye on the needle and make sure I don't overshoot it in the other direction, since I'm already pretty close to the VOR. The closer you are to the VOR, the more sensitive the needle is going to become, so you really have to be careful, because in this case, we're really not far from the VOR at all. While I continue to fly towards the VOR, I'm going to review the rest of the procedure. I'll enable the autopilot just to make things a little bit easier for me so I can focus just on the procedure instead of also trying to fly the airplane at the same time. So the next part of the ODP reads something like this. Departures on BJC radial 340, clockwise to radial 150, climb on course. You'll recall that a VOR has 360 radials emitting out of it, one for each degree of heading. That means if I were departing on a heading anywhere between 340 clockwise to 150, that I could just go to the VOR and then fly off wherever I'm going on my flight. I showed this graphic in the flight planning section, but I'll show it again just to remind you. Anywhere in that green area means I can just go to the VOR and then continue my flight. Anywhere else, I need to follow that last part of the procedure. That last part, what it says is all others climb in BJC holding pattern to cross the VOR at or above 13,300 feet. It also says something like left turns 203 inbound. That means I'm going to need to fly a climbing holding pattern with the station as the endpoint of the inbound leg on the 203 radial. I drew it out to make it a little bit clearer how I need to enter and fly the climbing hold. I find keeping these straight without having a graphical representation to be actually really hard to do, so the drawing really comes in useful for me. The left turns 203 inbound part means that the hold ends at the VOR on radial 203. It's left turns once you reach the VOR, so it was easy to complete the hold on the diagram. Really all it is once I get to the VOR, I do a 180-degree turn, I continue for about a minute, then I do another 180-degree turn and fly right back towards the VOR. The only thing left to figure out from there is how to enter the climb and hold. Since I'm coming from the opposite direction of the hold right now, I'm going to start by flying outbound on the 203 radial for about a minute. After that, I'm going to turn right to come back around and intercept the 023 radial towards the VOR. You can see that on the purple line that I drew next to the hold. Because the inbound part of the hold terminates at the VOR, the actual radial I need to fly to the station is radial 023, which is 180-degree opposite of 203. So I set my CDI needle to that course before takeoff just to make things a little bit easier for me. I also tuned the VOR frequency and I changed the CDI mode to VOR so that I can track the VOR a little bit easier. The other two things that I enabled were the DME settings in the PFD options, as well as the wind. When there's wind, you need to adjust your heading a little bit to make sure you stay on course, and having that little indicator in the primary flight display makes it a whole lot easier. So now that I've been flying outbound for 1 minute, I can start my turn to the right and I can begin to move to intercept the 023 radial. So you can see the needle is pretty much aligned right now, but as I'm going to turn, it's going to start to move more towards the right, which means I'm going to need to turn a little bit more than heading 023 to be able to re-intercept it before I get to the VOR. Once I've intercepted the radial, then I just fly the rest of the way inbound to the VOR. Once I get back to the VOR, that's where I'm going to start the actual hold. As we saw in the graphic, the first thing we're going to do is a left turn. So I'm going to do a left turn of 180 degrees, which is going to take me back on the outbound leg of the hold. When you turn to the outbound leg of the hold, the CDI needle is going to indicate that the flight path is to the left, and that's normal since we just turned 180 degrees. If you made your turn at a standard rate and you do the same for the inbound leg, you should be able to get right back on the inbound course almost like magic. That's of course assuming you've corrected properly for any wind, and in my case the wind is blowing from right to left on the outbound leg, so I set my heading to be a bit more to the right of 203 so that I crab into the wind and stay on a track of 203 across the ground. I'm going to continue my climb up to my cruise altitude until I've reached at least 13,000 feet. As you can see, I'm still a little bit short right now, so I'm going to have to probably do just one more loop of the hold before I can continue with the rest of my flight. I can use the little clock at the bottom of the primary flight display to know how long I've been flying outbound. So once I complete my 180-degree turn, I can just check the timer, wait 1 minute, and when the minute is up, I can turn back in towards the VOR again, re-intercept the 023 radial again, and then once I get to the VOR, I check my altitude one last time. I'll probably skip forward just a little bit at this point since there's not much to see in the hold. Really all I'm doing is going around and climbing to my cruise altitude. Alright, so I am heading back towards the VOR again after my second loop of the hold, and as you can see I'm about to cross 13,300 feet. That means that once I get to the VOR, I can now resume the rest of my flight. In my case, I have a GPS flight path set. So once I get to the VOR, I'm going to set my CDI back to GPS, and then all I'm going to do is turn to intercept the course to head to my destination, which in this case is Aspen. Hopefully this video gave you a bit of an appetite to try flying an obstacle departure. If you did get some value out of this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them below.